Do you take this woman to be your wife, according to God's law?
I do.
I do.
The marriage was never meant to be a love match. It was a transaction drafted in the smell of wet earth and grief. He took his dead friend's sister out of pity and a drunken vow. She took him out of sheer exhaustion. Neither expected the quiet, suffocating ruin of actually falling. The graveyard smelled of turned soil and wet wool. Arthur stood near the open pit, the damp cold seeping through the soles of his custom leather boots, settling into his bones like a permanent ache. It was raining. Not a tragic, sweeping downpour, but a miserable, spitting drizzle that made noses run and knuckles crack. Beside the grave stood Beatrice. She wasn't weeping. Arthur watched her out of the corner of his eye, waiting for the theatrical swoon expected of a grieving sister. It never came. Beatrice stood rigid, a dark wool shawl pulled tight around her narrow shoulders, holding an umbrella that leaked a steady, rhythmic drip onto the brim of her hideous bonnet. Her face was pale, the skin around her mouth tight, her lips chapped. She looked 28, unloved, and entirely exhausted. She looked exactly like what she was. A spinster whose only anchor to the world had just been lowered into the mud. Thomas was dead. A patch of black ice, a panicked gelding, and a snapped neck. It was a stupid, mundane way to die, devoid of glory. Arthur felt a heavy, dull block of guilt sitting in his chest, right beneath his sternum. Thomas had been his oldest friend, the only man who hadn't treated the Duke of Westford like a walking bank vault. And now he was in a box, and Arthur was left with a hangover, a ruined pair of boots, and Thomas's sister. The wake was held in the parlor of Thomas's crumbling ancestral home. The wallpaper was peeling in the corners, smelling of damp plaster and old mice. Arthur stood by the fireplace, drinking a glass of cheap, sharp sherry that burned the back of his throat. He watched Beatrice. She wasn't receiving condolences so much as managing a morbidly awkward social gathering. She collected empty teacups. She instructed the maid to sweep up the mud tracked in by the vicar. Her hands were red, the skin around the nails bitten down. She had nothing. Arthur knew this because Thomas had told him over a game of billiards 3 months ago, drunk and weeping. Their father had gambled away the estate's revenue, mortgaged the land, and left them with a pile of promissory notes. With Thomas gone, the entailment meant the house would pass to a distant, greedy cousin. Beatrice would be thrown out before the month was over. She would have to become a governess, or a companion to some dreadful old dowager who would work her to the bone for a crust of bread. Arthur set his glass on the mantelpiece. The clink of crystal against wood sounded too loud. He walked across the faded Persian rug, his footsteps heavy. Beatrice was stacking saucers. "Leave those," Arthur said. His voice was raspy from cigar smoke and lack of sleep. Beatrice didn't look up. "Someone has to wash them, Your Grace. The scullery maid is in hysterics in the pantry because Thomas once gave her a ribbon." "Leave them," he repeated, harsher this time. She paused, her fingers gripping a porcelain saucer. Slowly, she turned to face him. Her eyes were not a poetic color. They were the color of dirty ice, a pale, flat gray. "Is there something you need, Arthur?" She was the only person left in the world who called him by his Christian name without an invitation. "We need to discuss your situation," he said bluntly. He didn't know how to be gentle. Gentleness felt like a lie. "My situation is quite clear. I am packing tomorrow." "Where will you go?" "A registry office in London. I hear the market for aging, sour-tempered governesses who speak passable French is booming." Her tone was dry, but Arthur saw the faint tremor in her jaw. She was terrified. She was just hiding it behind a wall of practical sarcasm. Arthur looked at her, really looked at her. Her hair was a mousy brown, pinned up in a severe knot that pulled her skin too tight. She was too thin. Her collar was frayed. A profound, irritating sense of duty clamped around his throat. He had promised Thomas he would look out for her. He had nodded, drunk on brandy, and said, "I'll see she doesn't starve, Tom." "You aren't going to London," Arthur said. He jammed his hands into his pockets. "You're going to marry me." Beatrice dropped the saucer. It didn't shatter, just clattered loudly against the floorboards, spinning like a coin before settling. The silence in their corner of the room was absolute. "I beg your pardon," she whispered, her voice stripped of its usual bite. "I am 32. I need an heir. I need a duchess who won't spend my fortune on hats or weep when I prefer to be left alone. You need a home and a bank account." Arthur didn't look at her face. He looked at the frayed lace at her throat. "Thomas wouldn't want you sleeping in a drafty attic teaching spoiled brats how to play the pianoforte. Marry me. It's a practical arrangement." Beatrice stared at him. She didn't flush. She didn't gasp. She just looked at him with a weary, calculating exhaustion. He saw the exact moment her pride warred with her survival instinct. Survival won. It always did. "A practical arrangement," she repeated, the words tasting like ash. "You will have your own wing at my estate, your own allowance. I won't bother you. You won't bother me." She swallowed hard. The tendons in her neck stood out. "I see." She reached down, picked up the saucer, and set it carefully on the stack. "Very well, Arthur. If you insist on martyring yourself, I am too tired to stop you." They were married 3 days later by special license. The church was empty, smelling bitterly of old beeswax and cold stone. Beatrice wore her dark mourning dress. Arthur wore a black coat. When the vicar told him to kiss the bride, Arthur leaned in and pressed his lips to her cheek. Her skin was freezing, tasting faintly of salt and peppermint. She flinched, just a fraction of an inch, pulling away before he had fully retreated. They signed the register. The scratch of the quill echoed in the silent vestry like a scratching rat. Arthur paid the vicar, ushered his new wife into the waiting carriage, and shut the door. The trap had sprung. He just wasn't sure yet which one of them was caught in it. The carriage ride to Arthur's country seat in Yorkshire took 2 days. It was a brutal, bone-rattling journey characterized by the smell of damp leather and a silence so thick it felt like a third passenger. Beatrice stared out the window at the bleak, frost-bitten landscape. Arthur pretended to read a leather-bound book on agricultural reform. He didn't turn a page for 3 hours. When they finally arrived, the house loomed out of the fog like a sprawling limestone fortress. It was massive, severe, and utterly unwelcoming. As the carriage crunched to a halt on the gravel drive, Arthur saw Beatrice's hands tighten in her lap. Her knuckles went white. "It's large," was all she said. "It's drafty," Arthur replied, stepping out and offering her a hand. She ignored his hand, gathering her heavy skirts and climbing down the steps herself. Her boot hit a puddle of dirty water, splashing mud onto her hem. She didn't curse or fuss. She merely sighed, a short, sharp exhalation through her nose, and walked toward the heavy oak doors. For the first 3 weeks, their marriage was a study in avoidance. Arthur kept to the east wing, barricading himself in his study with a decanter of whiskey and ledgers that didn't need balancing. He was avoiding her. He knew it, and he despised himself for it. Every time he saw her in the hallway, she looked like a ghost haunting his conscience. She was a walking, breathing reminder of Thomas's dead body in the mud. He couldn't look at her without smelling the wet earth of the graveyard. But Beatrice did not behave like a ghost. She did not confine herself to her rooms to weep. She did not write tragic letters to friends she didn't have. Instead, she took over the house. Arthur began to notice her not by sight, but by consequence. He noticed that the fires in the study were suddenly drawing properly, no longer filling the room with bitter wood smoke. He noticed that the meals changed from heavy, over-salted mutton to roasted fowl with sharp, herbaceous sauces. He noticed the rhythmic, muffled thud of a hammer one afternoon and found her in the gallery, standing on a chair, personally nailing down a loose floorboard because she was tired of tripping over it. He had stood in the doorway watching her. She was wearing an apron over a plain gray morning dress. Her hair had escaped its tight pins, hanging in limp, disorganized strands around her face. She had a smudge of dirt on her chin. She looked entirely unducal. "We have carpenters for that," Arthur had said, his voice echoing in the long gallery. Beatrice didn't jump. She hit the nail one last time, driving it flush with the wood before stepping off the chair. She wiped the back of her hand across her forehead, smearing the dirt further. "Your carpenter is drunk by noon, Arthur, and I tore the hem of my petticoat on this board yesterday. I prefer immediate solutions. You are a duchess now. You shouldn't be wielding a hammer." She looked at him, her gray eyes narrowing. "A title does not render my hands useless. If you prefer me to sit on a velvet cushion and embroider pointless flowers, you married the wrong spinster." She picked up her hammer and walked past him, leaving a faint scent of dried lavender and brass polish in her wake. Arthur watched her go, a strange, irritable tightness gripping his chest. She didn't care about his title. She didn't care about him. She was just surviving in his house, making it her own, piece by practical piece. The collision happened late on a Tuesday night. A violent storm was lashing against the windows, throwing sheets of rain against the glass with the sound of handfuls of gravel. Arthur couldn't sleep. The whiskey wasn't working. He left his bedroom, carrying a single candlestick, and headed down the long, freezing corridor to the library to find a book dull enough to knock him out. He pushed the heavy mahogany door open. The library was dark, save for the dying embers in the grate and a single oil lamp burning on the massive central desk. Sitting behind the desk, wrapped in a woolen blanket, was Beatrice. She was bent over a stack of household accounts, a pair of wire-rimmed spectacles perched on the end of her nose. Her fingers were stained with black ink. She looked up as the door clicked. "Are the ledgers keeping you awake, Beatrice?" Arthur asked, his voice harsh in the quiet room. He walked in, setting his candle on a side table. "Someone has to read them," she said, pulling off her spectacles and rubbing the bridge of her nose. "Your steward has been overcharging you for coal by 20% for the last 3 years. Did you know that?" "I don't care about the coal." "Well, you should. It's your money. Or do you enjoy being robbed blindly?" "I enjoy being left in peace," he snapped, taking a step toward the desk. The flickering light cast deep shadows under his eyes. He felt ragged, exposed. "Why are you always working? Why are you always moving, fixing, auditing? Can you not just sit still?" Beatrice stood up, the blanket falling from her shoulders to pool on the floor. The air between them suddenly felt dense, charged with the static of the storm outside. "Sit still and do what, Arthur?" she demanded, her voice rising, losing its flat, practical edge. "Sit still and think. Think about Thomas. Think about the fact that I am completely alone in the world, chained to a man who can't even stand to look me in the eye because I remind him of a corpse." Arthur flinched. The words hit him like a physical blow. He stepped closer to the desk, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "I gave you a home." "You gave me a mausoleum," she fired back, her chest heaving. "You bought me out of guilt. You bought me because you felt sorry for me. Don't pretend this was an act of grace. It was cowardice. It was duty," he snarled, leaning over the desk, his face inches from hers. He could see the pulse beating frantically at the base of her throat. He could smell the sharp tang of ink and the warmth of her skin. "Duty," she spat the word like poison. "Is that why you flinch when we are in the same room? Is duty why you look at me like I am a burden you are dragging behind you?" She stared up at him, her gray eyes blazing, damp with unshed, furious tears. "I am not a ghost, Arthur. I am here. I am alive, and I am suffocating." Arthur looked at her cracked lips, at the ink stains on her fingers, at the furious, messy, vital reality of her. The cold, dead thing inside his chest shifted, cracking loudly in the silence of the room. He didn't know what to do with the sudden, violent urge to reach across the wood and grab her. He stepped back instead, the breath rattling in his lungs. "Then breathe, Beatrice," he said roughly, turning toward the door, "because I don't know how to save you." He left the room, the sound of the rain masking the heavy, frantic beating of his own heart. Winter hit the Yorkshire moors not with a graceful snowfall, but with the brutal, sideways slashing of sleet. It coated the heath in a thick layer of gray ice, snapping the branches of the ancient oaks and turning the roads into jagged, impassable ruts. Inside the house, the temperature plummeted. The stones sweated freezing water. Arthur spent his mornings in the stables, wrapped in a heavy wool greatcoat, helping the grooms check the horses' hooves for thrush in the damp. He preferred the sharp, ammonia smell of manure and damp hay to the cavernous silence of the manor. He preferred the simple, physical labor of brushing down a mare to the complicated, twisting knot in his gut whenever he thought about the library. He had not spoken to Beatrice beyond terse nods since their argument over the ledgers. He told himself he was giving her space. In reality, he was hiding. The collapse happened on a Thursday. A stable boy came running through the courtyard, boots sliding in the frozen mud, gasping for breath. The roof of the old stone tithe barn down in the lower valley had caved in under the weight of accumulated ice. 3 tenant farmers had been inside trying to secure the remaining winter feed. Arthur didn't think. He grabbed his medical kit, a battered leather satchel he'd carried during his brief, miserable stint in the cavalry, ordered 2 wagons hitched, and rode out into the biting wind. The sleet felt like needles against his cheeks. When he reached the barn, it was a ruin of shattered slate and splintered timber. The smell of wet dust and crushed barley hung heavy in the freezing air. 2 men were already out, sitting in the mud, clutching bruised limbs, their breath pluming white. The third, a young man named Miller, was pinned beneath a heavy crossbeam, screaming in high, thin bursts that made the horses flatten their ears. Arthur threw himself off his gelding, boots sinking ankle-deep in the freezing muck, and ran to the wreckage. He and 4 other men heaved against the massive oak beam. It wouldn't budge. Arthur's hands were numb, his breath burning in his lungs like swallowed glass. "Again!" he roared, driving his shoulder into the rough wood, feeling the fibers tear at his coat. The wood groaned, lifting just enough. "Pull him!" Hands dragged the boy backward. Arthur let the beam drop. He collapsed to his knees in the mud, panting, staring at Miller's leg. The bone was visible. A bright, jagged piece of white breaking through the torn corduroy trousers, slick with dark, pulsing blood. Arthur ripped open his leather satchel. His fingers were shaking too badly from the cold to properly unspool the bandages. He fumbled, dropping a roll of linen into the mud. He swore a vicious, ugly sound. "Move your hands." Arthur jerked his head up. Beatrice was kneeling beside him. She wore no bonnet. A thick woolen shawl was tied hastily over a men's riding coat that dwarfed her frame. Her hem was soaked black with mud. She didn't look at Arthur. She reached into the satchel, her bare hands steady, and pulled out a clean roll of linen and a flask of carbolic acid. "What are you doing here?" Arthur demanded, his voice cracking against the wind. "Hold his shoulders," Beatrice ordered, entirely ignoring the question. She uncorked the flask with her teeth, spitting the stopper into the mud. "This is going to burn, Mr. Miller. Close your eyes." She poured the antiseptic directly over the open wound. The boy thrashed, screaming, throwing his head back. Arthur threw his weight over the boy's chest, pinning his shoulders to the frozen ground, his muscles straining against the sudden, violent panic. Beatrice didn't flinch at the blood or the screaming. She worked with brutal efficiency. She packed the wound, wrapped the linen tight, pulling it taut with sharp, unforgiving jerks to stem the bleeding. Her hands were coated in red. The wind whipped a stray lock of wet brown hair across her face, sticking to her cheek. Arthur watched her hands. They were not soft. They were capable, stained with another man's blood, tying a knot with the precision of a sailor. He felt a sudden, terrifying jolt of pure, unadulterated awe. It slammed into his chest, entirely bypassing his brain, settling heavy and hot in his stomach. "Get him in the wagon," Beatrice said, sitting back on her heels. Her breathing was heavy. She looked at her bloody hands, then wiped them ruthlessly on the front of her coat, smearing the crimson into the dark wool. They rode back in the wagon with the wounded men, huddled beneath tarpaulins. The sleet had turned to a thick, driving rain. Beatrice sat on the wooden bench beside Arthur. She was shivering, a violent, uncontrollable trembling that rattled her teeth. Arthur looked at her profile. Her lips were entirely blue. The tip of her nose was red. She looked drowned and exhausted. Without thinking, without calculating the risk of rejection, he reached out, grabbed the lapels of her oversized coat, and dragged her against his side. She stiffened instantly, a plank of rigid wood against his ribs. "You are freezing," Arthur muttered, staring straight ahead at the muddy road. He unbuttoned his heavy greatcoat and wrapped the excess fabric around her shoulders, enclosing her in the heat of his own body. For a long moment she stayed rigid. He could feel the frantic, bird-like beating of her heart against his side. The smell of her filled his nose, copper blood, wet wool, and the sharp, clean scent of rain on her skin. Slowly, inch by inch, the fight drained out of her. She slumped against him, her head dropping heavily onto his shoulder. She didn't speak. She just let him hold her weight. Arthur rested his jaw lightly against the top of her wet head. The guilt was still there, the ghost of Thomas still riding in the wagon with them. But beneath it, a new, terrifying root had taken hold in the dark. He tightened his arm around her waist, feeling the deep, rhythmic pull of her breathing against his side, and knew, with absolute certainty, that he was utterly ruined. The truce changed the geography of the house. They no longer avoided the shared spaces. Instead, they inhabited them with a tense, hyper-aware caution. Arthur stopped taking his whiskey in his study. He began bringing his ledger books and a glass of scotch into the small parlor where Beatrice took her evening tea. They rarely spoke. The silence between them was no longer the empty, suffocating void of the first month. It was thick, heavy, and loud. Arthur found himself unable to read a single line of text. He would stare at the columns of numbers, but his brain was cataloging the sounds across the room, the scratch of her pen, the rustle of her skirts when she shifted her weight, the soft, rhythmic clink of her teacup hitting the saucer. He started noticing her hands. He noticed the ink calluses on her middle finger. He noticed the way she rubbed her temples when the accounts wouldn't balance. He noticed the pale, delicate skin on the inside of her wrists when her sleeves slipped back. It made his throat tight. It made him want to cross the room, grab those wrists, and pin them to the back of the chair. The sudden flashes of violence in his own desire terrified him. He was a man built on control, and Beatrice was a slow, deliberate unraveling of his seams. It happened on a Tuesday in late January. The fire in the parlor had burned down to glowing red-hot ash. The wind was howling outside, rattling the window panes in their leaded frames. Beatrice had been staring at the same page of a French novel for 20 minutes without turning it. Arthur was watching her. He had abandoned his pretense of reading an hour ago. He was nursing a glass of scotch, the amber liquid catching the dying firelight. "You aren't reading," Arthur said. The sudden sound of his voice in the quiet room was like a gunshot. Beatrice blinked, looking up slowly. The shadows in the room hollowed out her cheeks, making her eyes look massive and dark. "Neither are you. I asked you a question." She closed the book with a soft thud, setting it on the table. She didn't look at him. She looked at the fire. "I was thinking." "About what?" "About the fact that we have been married for 3 months, and I do not know if you take sugar in your tea, Arthur." Her voice was completely flat, devoid of its usual defensive sarcasm. It sounded hollowed out. "I know how much you pay your stable master. I know you prefer the linen sheets in the winter over the flannel. I know you walk with a slight limp when it rains because of a fall you took in France. But I do not know how you take your tea." "I don't drink tea," he said softly. "I know," she whispered. She finally turned her head to look at him. "We are strangers living in a museum, waiting to die." Arthur set his glass down. The scotch sloshed, spilling over the rim, stinging his fingers. He stood up. The room felt incredibly small. He walked across the worn rug, his boots making no sound. He stopped in front of her chair. She didn't look away. She didn't shrink back. She tilted her head up, meeting his gaze. "I am not waiting to die, Beatrice," he said. His voice was a harsh rasp, pulled from the bottom of his chest. "Then what are you waiting for?" she challenged, her voice trembling slightly, betraying the calm mask of her face. "You look at me like I am a tragedy you are forced to endure. You touch me like I am made of glass." "I don't touch you at all." "Exactly." The word was a wet, choked sound. A single tear broke free, tracking through the dust on her cheek. It was the first time he had ever seen her cry, not at her brother's grave, not when she was bleeding on a barn floor. Now, over a cup of tea they didn't drink. Arthur's control snapped. It didn't break cleanly. It shattered. He reached down, gripping her upper arms, and pulled her out of the chair. She gasped, her hands coming up to press against his chest. He backed her up against the heavy oak bookshelf. A heavy leather volume fell to the floor, the pages crumpling, but neither of them looked. "You want me to touch you?" Arthur breathed, his face inches from hers. He could smell the lavender soap on her skin, underlaid with a sharp tang of female sweat and fear. "Do you have any idea what you are asking?" "I am asking you to be in the room with me." She fired back, her hands curling into the lapels of his coat, gripping the wool like a lifeline. Her gray eyes were furious, desperate, wide. "I am asking you to stop treating me like a ghost." He kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't a poetic, sweeping romance. It was a collision. Their teeth clashed hard enough to make Arthur's jaw ache. Beatrice let out a muffled, shocked sound against his mouth, her hands releasing his lapels to push frantically against his shoulders. For a second, he thought he had made a terrible mistake, that he had ruined the fragile, jagged thing between them. Then her fingers slid up his shoulders, tangling violently in the hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. She kissed him back with a raw, unpracticed desperation. She tasted of stale tea and salt. He shoved his hands into her hair, tearing out the severe pins, letting the heavy, mousy brown weight of it fall over his hands. He kissed her until he tasted the metallic tang of blood on his bottom lip. He pressed his body flush against hers, pinning her to the books, letting her feel the heavy, unforgiving reality of his desire. She made a small, broken noise in the back of her throat, her hips shifting against him. Arthur groaned, his hands dropping to her waist, gripping her through the heavy fabric of her dress, hard enough to leave bruises. He tore his mouth away, pressing his face into the crook of her neck, his breath tearing through his lungs in ragged gasps. "I am not enduring you, Beatrice," he said against her skin, his voice shaking. "God help me, I am dying of you." Beatrice squeezed her eyes shut, burying her face in his shoulder. She didn't say anything. She just clung to him in the dark, her fingers digging into his back, anchored entirely by the man who had bought her out of pity and was now breaking apart in her hands. The morning light was unforgiving. It crept through the gaps in the heavy velvet curtains, casting harsh gray lines across the tangled bed sheets. Arthur lay on his back, staring at the plaster molding on the ceiling. His shoulder ached. The air in the room smelled heavily of wood smoke, sweat, and the faint, powdery scent of lavender. Beside him, Beatrice slept. She was curled on her side, the thick quilt pushed down to her waist, leaving her bare back exposed to the drafty room. Her skin was pale, marked by a constellation of faint, pale freckles across her shoulder blades and a small, purpling bruise just below her collarbone where his mouth had been hours before. Arthur didn't touch her. The crushing weight of the hangover had nothing to do with whiskey. It was guilt. It tasted like ash and copper in the back of his throat. He had crossed a line in the dark, driven by a blinding, selfish starvation. He had taken his dead friend's sister, a woman he had sworn to protect, and dragged her into the messy, desperate wreckage of his own desires. He had promised Thomas a safe harbor for her. Instead, he had made her a casualty of his own loneliness. He slid out of the bed carefully, the freezing oak floorboards shocking the bottoms of his feet. He found his trousers in a crumpled heap near the armoire, pulled them on, and grabbed his shirt. He didn't lace his boots. He left the room without looking back, the heavy oak door clicking shut with a quiet, final sound. When Beatrice woke, the bed was cold. She rolled over, reaching out a hand, her knuckles brushing against the crisp, empty linen. The indentation of his head on the pillow was the only proof he had been there at all. She pulled her hand back, curling it into a tight fist against her chest. She didn't cry. The tears had been burned out of her years ago. Instead, a familiar, practical armor settled over her ribs, locking into place. He regretted it. Of course he did. In the cold light of day, she was just the spinster sister again. The charity case he had compromised in a moment of weakness. Beatrice sat up, ignoring the dull ache in her thighs. She found her discarded chemise and pulled it over her head, the coarse cotton scraping against her sensitive skin. She dressed quickly, eschewing the corset, throwing a heavy wool day dress over her frame and violently pinning her mousy hair back into its severe, ugly knot. She found him in the gunroom. The room smelled of gun oil, beeswax, and cold iron. Arthur was sitting at the heavy oak workbench, methodically dismantling a Purdy shotgun. His hands were covered in grease, his white shirt half unbuttoned and hanging loose. He didn't look up when the door opened, but the rigid set of his shoulders told her he knew exactly who it was. "Are you going to shoot me, or simply clean the weapons until I pack my trunks?" Beatrice asked. Her voice was flat, devoid of tremor. Arthur stopped wiping the barrel. He stared at his blackened hands. "I am cleaning the guns." "You are hiding." "I am giving you the dignity of privacy, Beatrice." He finally looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. He looked entirely wretched. "I took advantage of your situation last night. It was a failure of character. I apologize." The apology hit her like a physical slap. It was so formal, so utterly devoid of the desperate, gasping man who had pinned her against a bookshelf and begged her to let him stay. "My situation," she repeated, the words brittle. "You think last night was about my situation? I think you were lonely, and I was selfish." Arthur set the rag down. He stood up, towering over the workbench, though he kept his distance. "Thomas trusted me. I promised him I would keep you safe. I behaved like a ruffian." Beatrice stared at him. The sheer, suffocating arrogance of his guilt made her vision blur at the edges. She walked fully into the room, her boots clicking sharply against the stone floor, stopping only when she was a foot away from the bench. "Thomas is dead," she said. Arthur flinched, as if she had struck him. "Don't." "He is dead, Arthur. He is rotting in a box in the mud, and he does not care about your honor or my virtue." Her voice echoed off the cabinets, harsh and tearing. "You think you are being noble? You think you are honoring his memory by treating me like a fragile porcelain doll that you accidentally broke? I ruined you," he snarled, the control finally snapping, his hands gripping the edge of the workbench until his knuckles turned white. "You were meant to be safe here, untouched. Instead, I couldn't keep my hands off you. I couldn't stop looking at your damn ink-stained fingers and wanting to drag you into my bed." "Then why did you walk away?" she fired back, stepping closer, closing the distance between them. She could smell the gun oil and the sharp tang of his sweat. "If you wanted me, why did you leave me waking up alone in a freezing room, wondering if I disgusted you?" Arthur's breath hitched. "You don't disgust me. God, Beatrice, you terrify me." The admission hung in the air, raw and bleeding. He looked down at her, his jaw clenching. "I am a cynical, bitter man," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "I don't know how to be gentle. I don't know how to give you the soft, romantic life you deserve." Beatrice reached across the workbench. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the front of his open shirt, her fingers brushing the hot, rough skin of his chest, and pulled him forward. "I don't want a soft life," she said fiercely, her gray eyes locking onto his. "I have spent my entire life surviving. I don't want poetry. I want the man who helped me set a shattered leg in the mud. I want the man who argues with me over the coal ledgers. I want you, Arthur. Not your duty, not your guilt. You." Arthur looked at her cracked lips, the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw, the stray hairs escaping her messy bun. The ghost of Thomas, the heavy, suffocating weight of duty, finally fractured and dissolved into the cold morning air. He reached up, his grease-stained hands gently framing her face, uncaring of the black marks he was leaving on her pale skin. He leaned down and pressed his mouth to hers. It wasn't desperate this time. It was deliberate. It was a surrender. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "You are going to ruin my ledgers," he murmured, his breath warm against her lips. "I am going to rewrite them entirely," she corrected softly, her hands sliding up to rest against his neck. They stood there in the cold gunroom, surrounded by iron and oil. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was messy, stained with grease and built over a graveyard. But as Arthur pulled her solidly against his chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic beating of her heart against his own, he knew it was the only foundation that would never crumble. The mud, the grief, and the bitter winters built a foundation far stronger than any fairy tale ever could. What did you think of Arthur and Beatrice's messy, raw journey from obligation to undeniable devotion? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you want more grounded, unapologetic, historical romances that show the gritty, real side of love, hit the like button, share this video with a fellow reader, and subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss a story.